Charles, thanks so much for joining me. Look, before we get to the details of AUKUS and what might happen there, how do you think the incoming Trump administration will view China, will approach this very important relationship with China?
Competitively. That's where we have to start the conversation. Under Trump's first term in office, we know that he really took a competitive across-the-board set of policies. It led, as this is his thinking, with trade policy and with tariffs. They will loom large in a second Trump administration. He's told us as much and fairly regularly. But if we look at the suite of policies that came out under the first Trump presidency, which is a decent benchmark to begin our evaluation of what things might begin to look like, it was also enhanced U.S. military posture around the region. It was a more competitive approach to technological competition. We talked about the economic space. And one of the things that I heard rather regularly from those who were serving in that administration was we're going to take a competitive approach on every issue. That means in international institutions like the United Nations, where China has taken over seats, like on the Human Rights Council, in the World Health Organization and other places. So it's an issue by issue specific question about what the exact policy will look like, but I think it's a fair starting point to assess that Trump will view the relationship competitively and will look to be bringing a range of options to that discussion.
We can expect to see a greater level of competition between the US and China under Trump, and trade being, I suppose, the most obvious example of that immediately.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really important to point out is while we'll get wrapped up in the Trump conversation, no doubt here, that this is something that's been building from Trump to Biden to Trump again in terms of bipartisan feelings towards China are rather robust in the need to push back in competitive spaces. It will look differently between a Democratic and a Republican administration and certainly a Trump administration. But yes, I think it's a fair expectation to understand that there will be a more robust set of policies. You asked, though, about trade and tariffs, because that's where, in some ways, the Trump administration might get in its own way on bringing a broad coalition to bear against China.
We might come back to that. With Taiwan, we know Joe Biden has said, I think it's 4 times on the record, that he would come to Taiwan's aid militarily in the event of China trying to annex Taiwan. Donald Trump seems to have been a bit more dismissive when he's been asked about this. I think he said, Taiwan's 9,500 miles away. At the end of the day, would he come to Taiwan's defense?
Well, he hasn't told me, so I don't know. But this is an important point that we don't know, and we don't know the outcome. Now, you quoted what he did say about that it looked less significant. We can also quote some of his advisors who served even as his national security advisor in his first term, who said that he really didn't care that much for Taiwan. And sometimes we hear words out of his mouth that make it look like it is a bargaining chip to use against China. That's a very dangerous position for Taiwan itself. We've also heard words from those in Trump's circle that they expect the Taiwanese to vastly ramp up their own spending on their own defenses. So it is a different picture of what we're talking about for Taiwan, and one that I think is much more perilous in some ways.
So Taiwan should be nervous.
Taiwan has a lot of work to do for itself and with the Trump administration.
Well then, for Australia's interests, AUKUS, a lot of debate about what happens to that. What do you think? What do you think will happen? Will Trump honour that AUKUS deal?
I think we don't know, if we're going to be honest. We've heard supporters of AUKUS. Let me put my cards on the table. I, too, am a supporter in general of AUKUS. Say that, of course, this will carry over.
It's a good deal. Of course, he'll want to keep it in place.
But Trump himself has not ever said anything publicly about AUKUS, and he will be a deciding factor on this. So it depends, and it depends how well Australia can prosecute its case to Trump. Now, AUKUS looks like a deal that he should be able to get behind. Not only is Australia investing in the United States, but this is a classic example of allies doing more for themselves and alongside the United States.
Well, it does see Australia's defence spending increase. I mean, we're currently at just over 2% of GDP. It will rise to 2.4% of GDP within the decade. Plus, we're tipping in $3 billion US to the US industrial base to help make submarines here. You'd think that is going to count for something.
I think that will absolutely count for something. Whether or not that counts for enough is a different question, because I think Trump, we know, will want more.
Right.
And this question about 2% GDP spends, and we know that Australia is just over that.
Yeah, just
I
a
think
tick.
it's 2.03 if we're being precise. But I personally think that this is the wrong marker, right? We use this as a benchmark because NATO allies have pledged to spend 2% almost 10 years ago. It's the wrong metric to use because the better evaluation is, are countries spending enough to defend themselves as we have a vastly deteriorating security environment and as China and Russia and North Korea and Iran ramp up what they're spending?
So if that metric isn't the right one, is it does it need to be more tailored to, as you say, the threat that's being faced in that part of the world?
I think countries cannot make decisions about how much they should be spending based on a number. It has to be relative to what others, and particularly those who are adversarial powers, are spending. So yes, in answer to your question, defense spending needs to come up across the board, not just in Australia, not just in the United States, but across a number of states that are very concerned about what China's doing.
Critics of AUKUS, Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister, is one of them, point to the detail in the deal, which says that the President at the time can basically say, if this denigrates US capability, we're not going to sell Virginia-class submarines to Australia. Now, technically, the first of those subs isn't due until 2032. So it would be the next president, not Donald Trump, the next one, who could still make that call. But Donald Trump could still kill the deal in the meantime, couldn't he? If he doesn't think this is, if he fears this is going to denigrate their capability here.
He could, and I think we have to be honest about that. But there are a couple of other things that we need to consider. First of all, the president is not the only one who has a say. Congress actually sets the budget. So there's a budgetary question here too about how high U.S. defense budgets are set. And more importantly, and that clause that you referred to, is whether or not the United States is producing enough capabilities. We have mandates for how many submarines, how many aircraft carriers, how many destroyers the U.S. is supposed to have.
And that's not being met at the moment, is it?
It is not. And that's because America has a global presence. So that's why those mandates are set. It's not being set. The U.S. is supposed to produce about 2 Virginia-class attack submarines per year. We're currently at about 1.2 or 1.3 per year. The question, I think, because you rightly point out that the sale and the transfer of submarines won't even occur until the 2030s. The question is, how quickly can that number ramp up? And if we believe that subsea assets, particularly nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines, are the best deterrent tool that we have, how do we get to more?
And does that mean, coming back to what Australia might need to do, $3 billion US is already being put in, will that number have to increase?
I can't speculate on that. That number about the investment into the United States submarine industrial base has already been set. But there are a lot of other questions too about how much a submarine costs once you drive it off the parking lot, how much value it loses. Those parts might have been negotiated. I'm not in government right now, so I'm not privy to that. But there are other things that have to be looked at here. But it's not just the submarines. This is a slew of things that we're talking about that countries in a much degraded security environment need to be paying into.
Now, on climate change, we know Donald Trump wants to exit the Paris deal once again.
Yep.
Drill, baby, drill was his campaign slogan. What does this mean for global action on climate change, and in particular the Pacific, which regards climate change as their number one priority?
Yeah, well, first of all, let's say that the United States will not be a leader on climate change under Donald Trump. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. What this means specifically when we refer to the Pacific, where we know that climate change is the existential threat, is security threat number 1 through 10, but before you even begin to talk about geopolitical competition. Look, leaders in the Pacific are very savvy. They know what they're dealing with. In fact, relations between the Pacific and the United States started improving under Donald Trump's presidency, accelerated under the Biden presidency. So it strikes me as this is going to be challenging, particularly when you banish the term climate change from the political lexicon. But when we begin to talk about other things that will take place, like resilient infrastructure, that is something that the Pacific will get behind, that potentially a Trump administration could get behind too.
But specifically for the Australia-US alliance, Anthony Albanese and Joe Biden last year named climate change
as
and
a third
clean
pillar
energy.
of the alliance.
I was going to say, a third pillar of the alliance. Does that pillar crumble under Donald Trump?
Well, it's certainly not as strong as it would otherwise be. There's no doubt about this. But look, the third pillar, and when we talk about what Albanese and Biden did, they not only signaled there would be a third pillar of the alliance, but they also stood up a pact on climate change, critical minerals, and clean energy. Now, those other two, which will be enormously important for the transition to a cleaner energy environment, are not going to go away simply because they've become too profitable.
And this comes back to the trade question too, doesn't it? Because the great concern of the US and its allies is that China has too much of a stranglehold on critical minerals processing. So will there still be an incentive to set up separate supply chains of critical minerals involving Australia?
Absolutely there are. That is not going to go away. I think both Trump and those in his orbit are very conscious of this. Let's also note that this is easier to say than do. Figuring out how you deal with something that the market won't solve for itself and have non-market mechanisms to fix that. Governments are working on this now. I assume that will
subsidies
proceed. Yes, but it's really hard to do, particularly when it's such a stranglehold that the Chinese have, particularly on the refining of these critical minerals.
That personal relationship, though, could really matter when it comes to trying to negotiate any exemption for Australia from the tariffs that Donald Trump has promised to impose on all imports to the US. Will Australia, do you think, be in a good position to get an exemption? And what about the tariffs that he will impose on China? They're going to hurt Australia too eventually, aren't they?
Yeah, no, look, Trump has said that he is tariff man. He loves tariffs. It's the tool he reaches to for just about everything. He said he's going to start at 20% across the board, and if your name rhymes with China, we're talking about at least 60%. David, your question was about whether or not Australia is in a good position to advocate for itself, and the answer is yes. Right? It has a trade deficit with the United States. For reasons that only Donald Trump knows, this matters enormously to him. And so that's something that it's in favor. But, and I think this is really true of whether or not we're talking about AUKUS or about tariffs, Donald Trump has to hear the case directly from Australia. It's why personal relationships matter a lot. The fact that Australia runs a deficit with the United States should be a pretty good argument for their case, but they have to make that case with facts and figures directly to Trump himself.
And so the uncertainties about tariffs, about Taiwan, about so many other things when it comes to Donald Trump, do you see that as a strength, this unpredictability, or a weakness?
Well, it's both, isn't it? Because on the one hand, Donald Trump loves being unpredictable. He prides himself on this, and he says that Xi Jinping thinks I'm a madman. So there are some strengths when a potential adversary does not know where your red line is, how you might react to something in particular. And in his mind, at least, Donald Trump's mind, that creates deterrence because they don't know how the United States might react. The challenge, of course, is first of all with adversaries, if they don't know what your red lines are, if you're not clear about communicating those, you might find that you've tripped right over one. And with allies, they hear the same messages. And an uncertain, unpredictable America is one that's very hard for allies to line up next to. So what is his unpredictability? Is it a strength? Is it a liability? It is both. And it will be quite challenging to navigate this forward.
Final question about the personalities here and how much they matter. We know Anthony Albanese said things years ago about Donald Trump. We know Kevin Rudd, the ambassador, has said things more recently. He's scrubbed his tweets. Is any of that going to matter, do you think?
Maybe. It might, but it depends how Trump reacts, and it's very hard to predict how he reacts in the middle of the night. On the other hand, let's be quite clear that what you said about Donald Trump in the past is less important to Donald Trump than what you were saying about him in the future. Otherwise, he would not have J.D. Vance as his vice president at this point. You can say horrible things about him, and depending on what you're willing to say, what have you done for me today is, I think, how Donald Trump sees the world.
And a fascinating time ahead, no doubt. Charles Edel, thank you very much.
Thanks, David.